Thank you, Heather. And again, we would like to thank you for your patience as we work through our technology, and welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Shabana McCaleb, and I am today's moderator. If you have not done so, I would like to invite you to please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to all attendees. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: welcome from HCD, new ESG-CV notice presentation with HUD, next steps to reach 50% June spending deadline, questions and answer session. And now I will turn it over to Janice Waddell.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all here today. My name is Janice Waddell. I'm the Community Development Branch Chief at HCD. And again, we'd like to welcome everybody, especially if you haven't been with us before. We hold these weekly, so please join in again. Today, we're going to be focusing on the new ESG-CV notice and the 50% spending deadline coming up in June. We all want to work together so that California can reach that deadline. So thank you for joining us today. We're really happy to be joined today by Marlisa Grogan. Marlisa is a Senior Program Specialist from HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance, or SNAPS. And Marlisa is going to review the new notice with us. So welcome, Marlisa, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Next slide, please. Next slide. So some of these slides will probably look familiar to you if you've already joined the webinar that we had covering the same topic areas on the 19th. But I always learn from the great questions that everyone asks. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And for those of you who haven't had a chance, really appreciative of this opportunity to go through the notice high level. And then I think the materials from the 19th are about to be posted. So they should be up today on HUD.gov. So they'll also be available to you. But we in SNAPS really wanted to start the overview of the new notice, CPD 22-06, in the grounding equity, in grounding our work in equity, because that's really one of the major areas that we need to focus on to ensure that our COVID response is effective and targeted. So we know that the pandemic has amplified, it's brought to the forefront the historical and current discrimination experienced by racial and ethnic minoritized and marginalized groups. And these underlying health and social inequities have had the result of Black, Indigenous, and people of color being disproportionately impacted by the disease. That's very evident, and the data shows this in really stark form. We also know that people who are most harmed by coronavirus, housing instability, and homelessness include these historically marginalized groups, especially Black and Indigenous people, those who are elderly, and those who have health problems, especially respiratory problems. So this just shows how important the work that you all are doing as part of your overall COVID response work. Next slide, please. Beyond the direct impact on health, housing status, there's also the economic impact on our communities. Job loss, housing instability, and increased risk of homelessness. And these economic effects are also more likely to impact historically marginalized communities, especially Black and Indigenous people. So, you know, our culpability is also in our past public policies, which have created and fostered disparate housing outcomes for minoritized and marginalized groups. These are points that SNAPS has brought up in many, if not most of our trainings. It's also really important to bring up here as we're embarking on this sort of new phase of ESG-CV, to make sure that this is at the forefront of the work. And as you all are evaluating your ESG programs and seeking sort of direction for how to take your ESG programs in directions post CPD notice 22-06, it's really important to be considering all of this information that we currently know. Next slide, please. So to get a little bit more specific about how to integrate this work into your COVID-19 response, it's essential to be targeting our work and assistance to people who are experiencing an at-risk of homelessness, taking into account racial equity. We've linked here to President Biden's memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies to acknowledge the history here. And being that CARES Act resources are intended to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus, looking at this work as a way to make the environment the safest for people, namely housing people. That's the safest place for people to be. It's the most effective way to reduce risk of contracting the virus. So being that COVID-19 has amplified the historic and current racial biases and discrimination that's embedded in our system, processes, and practices, this is our chance to interrupt that cycle and make sure that we're looking forward, addressing equity and grounding equity in our work for COVID response. Next slide, please. So ESG-CV, as I just said, is our opportunity to address the disparate impact. And there are great examples throughout the country. We have linked here to those communities who have leveraged ESG-CV funds with a focus on equitable housing, generating equitable housing outcomes, and strongly recommend you check those out for inspiration and for ideas. And I want to reinforce that HUD is committed to working with you all, continuums of care, ESG recipients, to support communities, advancing their efforts to be more equitable and to close those racial disparities. So our page on the HUD Exchange is also linked here to find more information on ways that you can integrate racial equity in your work. There's some great resources there to check out. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of a contextual slide to just orient you all for what this new notice CPD 22-06 actually does. And it does not change anything in prior notices that are applicable to ESG-CV, namely CPD 2105 and CPD 2108, except where we expressly say we're changing something. So we do have a red line strikeout version of the ESG-CV notice 21-08 that we'll be releasing soon, so you can see exactly what is getting changed. But we try to be as specific as possible in 22-06, stating where this new notice impacts any previous requirements for ESG-CV. So, and just a quick reminder, CPD 21-05 is the rapid rehousing to rapid rehousing waiver. That's what we call it for short. It gives instructions for how you can follow up other rapid rehousing funded activities with ESG-CV rapid rehousing, and CPD 21-08 is the ESG-CV notice that is still in effect, but adjusted and amended by this new notice, 22-06. So if you as a recipient, a direct recipient of ESG funds, you've received any individual waivers or exceptions, you can continue to apply those. If any that you've received are more restrictive than a current flexibility that's provided in the latest ESG-CV notice, you are free to use the notice flexibility in 22-06. You don't need to notify the field office or submit any notifications or really do anything for the new extended expenditure deadlines, the progressive draw deadline, or any of the waivers in 22-06 to be in effect. They are in effect. They are widely applicable to all ESG recipients. So these are the new requirements, period. And you do not need to consider or take into account when HUD reviewed the substantial amendment or action plan. Way back when we issued the first ESG-CV notice, that was CPD 20-08. There was some specifics in applicability depending on when you submitted your substantial amendment. You no longer have to consider that at all. That is not anything that will impact the applicability of these waivers and alternative requirements. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a broad overview, a quick mention of what the notice actually includes, and then we can get into more specifics about them. The first is a housing stability case management waiver, which we're not going to focus on today, but the really high level takeaway here is that all of the 24-month cap on rental assistance and services for rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention is waived across the board. So this is more of a corrective waiver. You can extend assistance to households beyond 24 months within a 3-year period, and that is across the board for all rental assistance and services that you provide under rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. The other items that we waived or changed is replacing the March 31st, 2022 deadline for the 80% progressive expenditure deadline with a new June 16th, 2022 draw deadline for 50% of the total award. Get into more detail about that. Then we extended deadlines. No longer are we using the September 30th, 2022 overall expenditure deadline, but changed those into 3 separate buckets, depending on whether or not you need admin and HMIS costs for closeout or whether you're receiving reallocated funds. And we also have a waiver of the reallocation requirements to establish the reallocation process that's established in the notice. This does not have any direct impact on recipients or subrecipients in the way you're carrying out your program. This gave HUD the authority to establish the formula that we're using for reallocated funds and the timing to basically get the reallocated funds out as quickly as we can and not be restricted by the timeline that's otherwise established in the ESG regulations. Next slide, please. The notice waives the obligation deadlines for state ESG recipients. We'll talk about that extension. It establishes the process for the recapture and reallocation of funds. So we get into more detail about how HUD is going to carry out the recapture and reallocation process. And then it states that annual ESG used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus will no longer be able to use the flexibilities under the ESG-CV notices past September 30th, 2022. So that's when all ESG-CV waiver flexibilities will expire for annual ESG funds used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. And then finally, in the appendix of the notice, we describe the reallocation formula. Next slide, please. So here are the key dates to remember. The overall expenditure deadline for ESG-CV funds is September 30th, 2023. So that's extended 1 year. It would have ordinarily been September 30th of this year. We extended it 1 year out until September 2023. The one exception to that is for admin funds and HMIS funds needed to close out. So as you're winding down your program, if you don't have any reallocated funds, you can continue to use HMIS for final reporting, use admin to wrap up any monitorings or final closeout steps. Those admin and HMIS funds can also be used by subrecipients if those subs have received admin and HMIS funds. So that's an additional time period for those specific costs. And then if you are a recipient that receives additional funds through the reallocation process, you have until June 30th, 2024 to spend those funds. Next slide, please. So here's how we're going to calculate the recapture on the basis of non-compliance with the 50% draw deadline, which is June 16th, 2022, coming up at a rapid pace. We're going to take the total award for the recipient, that's ESG-CV1 and CV2, round 1 and round 2 funds. We're going to take into account any recaptured funds as a result of the September 30th, 2021 recapture. And then 50% of that is the target amount that recipients need to have drawn down from IDIS by June 16th, 2022. If you are a direct ESG recipient and you have not already been notified that HUD is recapturing funds, then this is not applicable to you, and we would just be taking your total award and then taking 50% of that as the measure, the target for what you need to have drawn down by the 16th. And I wanted to see if there's anything else to mention here. Okay, yes, and that's it. Next slide, please. All right, so I think we've gotten some questions about whether we were going to do 1 or 2 reallocations. We were entertaining the possibility of recapturing funds based on the September 2021 deadline, reallocating those funds, and then doing another recapture reallocation based on the June 16th. What we've decided to do is just do 2 recaptures and 1 reallocation. So the process is underway to recapture the September 30th, 2021 funds. Come June 16th, 2022, HUD will do another recapture of funds. And then as a result of both of those recaptures, we will be running the calculation on that 1 total recapture amount and then doing 1 reallocation of funds. We anticipate the reallocation taking into account the administrative steps that HUD has to take to process the recapture and prepare for the reallocation. It's likely to be around July, August timeframe. So I'm hesitant to pinpoint an exact date, but reallocated funds will likely be available to recipients as of the summer, or at least the end of the summer. We're going to provide additional technical assistance to both those recipients that are having funds recaptured, as well as those who are receiving reallocated funds. We do have an IDIS fact sheet that provides instructions for specifically what needs to happen in IDIS. For those who are having funds recaptured, there are steps that you can already take to adjust your activity amounts downwards. And once you're aware that you're receiving reallocated funds, you can also start taking initial steps at that point to make adjustments in IDIS. So that fact sheet is already available, but then CARES Act staff will also, from the SNAPS office, will also be reaching out to help recipients take those necessary steps. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we're looking at a July-August timeframe for reallocation to take place. We are going to, as part of those steps, all recaptured ESG-CV funds are going to be reallocated by formula to the recipients that qualify. And in order to be eligible to receive a reallocation, the ESG recipients have to reach both progressive deadlines. So they had to have met the September 2021 as well as the June 16th, 2022 deadline. And we will be implementing a minimum threshold. So in doing the formula, an allocation amount has to exceed $100,000 for a recipient to receive those reallocated funds. If it's below that amount, we would run the calculation again and then redistribute those funds to recipients that have exceeded that $100,000 minimum. So if you want to take a close look, go to Appendix 1 of the notice for the formula description. We also reiterate the recipient eligibility criteria for reallocation. As I mentioned before, we waive the ESG program requirements for reallocation, and that process is established in the notice, and it essentially allows us to run the formula, not as we traditionally use for annual ESG funds, but the formula that's described in Appendix 1. And then it also allows us to get the reallocated funds out as quickly as possible. Reallocated funds are subject to the same requirements and the same waivers. So treat them exactly the same as you would your ESG-CV1 and CV2 with the exception of that extended expenditure deadline until June of 2024 for reallocated funds. Next slide, please. So here is a quick overview of the formula description. The first step is to try to keep the funds, the recaptured funds within the same geographic area. So we go through a roll up or roll down calculation and implementing a maximum threshold, which is 50% of a recipient's original ESG-CV grant amount. So if funds are recaptured from a metropolitan city, we're first going to try to reallocate those funds to the urban county of which the metro city is a member government. If the urban county for some reason doesn't qualify for reallocated funds, then those funds would then be rolled up to the state. Similar, if a recapture is done from an urban county, we would try to reallocate to the metropolitan cities that are within that urban county, and then if not to those cities, then to the state. And the same would go for states. So if funds are recaptured from a state, they get recaptured to urban counties and metropolitan cities within the state. We're handling situations where there are multiple entities within the same county or state in a way that would distribute the funds in direct proportion to those recipients' share of the amounts originally allocated for rounds 1 and 2. So we would look at what those recipients, the proportional amount was for their original awards, and then follow that same proportion in divvying out the recaptured funds from the county or the state. And if no entities within the county or the state are eligible, then those funds would be kicked over to step 2, which I will describe right now. Next slide, please. So this national formula will be used to reallocate the remaining funds, and that includes, as I mentioned, any situation where there are no eligible recipients within the geographic area for a recipient from which we've recaptured funds, and also in cases where a recipient, an eligible recipient, has reached its maximum amount of reallocated funds. So this national formula takes into account the proportion of an eligible recipient's share of funds drawn for rapid rehousing and overall draws as of June 16th, 2022. So to get more reallocated funds, you want to draw as much as you can for rapid rehousing, and you want to draw as much as you can overall by June 16th. The more you draw down by June 16th in those two categories, the greater likelihood you are of receiving reallocated funds and the greater extent to which you'll receive reallocated funds. So whenever we hit a maximum amount, which again is 50% of your overall award, we would take the excess amount and then redistribute it again, run the formula again until those funds are gone. And then we are also implementing a minimum threshold of the $100,000. So that would also get redistributed until the funds are exhausted. Next slide. I think that might be it for me. Yes. All right. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks very much. So California has set some intermediate or goals that are a little bit sooner than the goals that were established by HUD, so that we can make sure that we hit all of HUD's goals. So for our funds requests to do the 50% drawn, the deadline to have your final request for funds to HCD is going to be a week earlier on June 9th. And that will allow time for us to ensure that we have all the appropriate documentation, get it processed, and make sure it reflects in IDAS as drawn by June 16th. So we'd like you to get those requests for funds in again by June 9th. There's been some questions asked about what the other deadlines HCD is looking at for the end of the grant. So for applicants who meet the deadline, and we'll discuss it with you on a case-by-case basis, but we would be looking to extend the deadlines on the grants to September of 23. And then the HMIS and admin would be extended to October of 23, with the final request for funds due by, and that's not on this slide, but we're going to be issuing a management memo that will have this information in it. But final request for funds by mid-November. That will give us time then to make sure that we've got all the data and the beneficiaries and everything updated in our systems prior to the December 31st closeout. We want to be able to close out with HUD, right at the end of that period. So those are the deadlines that HCD is setting in order to enable us to meet those final deadlines. But the first deadline we need to meet is our 50% drawn, and that's really what we've been focusing on right now at HCD. And so if you haven't submitted, we're showing quite a bit in accruals. If you haven't submitted your request for funds to invoice for those accruals, please get those to us as soon as possible so we can get those processed. If you're not at 50% drawn yet, please do everything you can to accelerate funding. With a lot of people available at HCD with a lot of expertise, with our partners from ICF who are available here to assist you if you need assistance. And then if you've spent more, please keep spending. That will help the state overall make sure that we achieve that 50% goal. So as I said, our partners at ICF, I'm sorry, are here to help. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Thanks, Janice. Next slide, please. So as Janice mentioned, and there are a lot of things we need to do to be able to meet the deadline in June that Marlisa indicated. Just like with other direct recipients from HUD, the state of California is also will be at risk of losing funds, which means you would be at risk of losing funds if we can't meet this June 16th deadline. So to do that, what we're asking is that the RFF is submitted and final and correct by June 9th, right? So moving through the system at that point. As you know, you often you go back and forth with your grant administrator sometimes to make sure things are correct. So to ensure that those RFFs are submitted timely, please get those to your grant administrator before June 9th, by June 2nd at the latest. That way we have some time before your final submission needs to go in on June 9th. Again, like Janice said, we are here to help. Your grant administrators are here to help. We have other folks we can pull in to help, to work directly with you and with your subrecipients as well. We want to highlight again the request for funds checklist that you all have. And if you don't have it, please ask your grant administrator, or if you've misplaced it or if you have new staff. The RFFs will get processed faster if they're correct when they come in. So that is often the biggest holdup in getting them turned around and submitted, is getting that checklist complete, so that it can be processed through the state system. One of the things we are continuing to see that the state cannot process is client personal identifying information. If it is not redacted, the state has to send it back. The state cannot hold client PII in its system. So it will be sent back if if it's not redacted. So please redact those pieces before you submit your RFF, and ask questions at any time when you need help. And we're glad to reach out and provide whatever kind of help we can in getting things processed. That looks like Aaron put the checklist in the chat, so there it is too. Thanks, Marlisa, for highlighting all the things HUD is doing to try and make sure funds stay where they need to be. Very much appreciate that. And I know that some of you are direct recipients of HUD as well. So this will be good information on both sides of how you're funded for some of you. Are there any questions, Aaron and team, that I'm missing in the chat?
Nope, nothing else.
Nope.
Oh, you just did get one.
I could take that one.
I was just going to ask you to.
So the landlord incentives reference security deposits. Those are separate activities from the security deposits that are ordinarily eligible under the rental assistance line item. So you could do 3 months of 3 months of landlord incentives in addition to the 2 months of security deposits.
Thanks, Marlisa. Thanks for your question, Rock. That will be a case-by-case basis, depending on spending projections for each community on whether the monthly invoicing will continue to be required. I know some of you were doing quarterly, but we will revisit that on a case-by-case basis, depending on spending. So that's a good question around the 50% recapture. So the way that it works, right? So if HUD decides to recapture money from the state will have to recapture money from you, because they won't have the money to pay you, right? And so there's a clause in your contracts that says, and Janice, you will know the language better than I, but it's subject to the availability of funds from HUD for this reason, right? That if there are compliance issues and funds are recaptured, then the state has to also recapture from subs, which is why we're trying to get the whole state to 50%, because we don't want to do that. HUD doesn't want to take money out of California. And at the same time, at the end of the day, Marlisa also wants all this money to be spent on homelessness, right? That HUD doesn't want at the end of the grant period to have money that was not spent. And so they will be recapturing funds so they can reallocate and make sure that the money is used as it was intended. So it's unfortunately, that's how it will have to happen if funds are indeed recaptured, but we are going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. We are a little over 30% drawn in IDIS right now, Andrea. So we have a little ways to go. And again, this is about actual expenses, right? Which is why Janet was, we know y'all have spent the money, so we're not worried about that. We know that you as subrecipients of the state have spent the money. We see your accruals and we know your projects, but the accruals don't count here. It has to be money drawn from the Treasury, which means it has to be expensed by HCD to HUD. So. We're very glad that the money is being spent and used in your communities. We just have to do a little bit better about getting it expensed back to HUD. Any last questions? Okay, sorry again for the technical difficulties. Like I said, we're recording this session, so that will be sent out so everybody has access to this information and to the slides. Thank you so much, Marlisa, for taking the time to hang out with California for a little while today. We really appreciate you being here.
Great to be with you all.
Thank you all so much.